Hello, this is TGC Requiem. I am here with an updated deck tech for Grixis Jund, or Blue Jund, as some people are calling it. Basically, it's just kind of named it a little differently because it plays so differently from the other Grixis decks that are out there. You have Grixis Control, Grixis Twin, Grixis Delver. This is a totally different Grixis deck. Really, it's kind of like a Jund deck. It has a lot of similar things to Jund. And so Grixis Jund, or Blue Jund, is kind of what the name is that's been sticking. It's considered similar because pretty much this package here, 3 Inquisition, 2 Thoughtseize, 4 Lightning Bolt, 3 Terminate, some Kolaghan's Commands and Liliana's of the Veil. You got Tasigur, Livia, which is fairly popular in Jund as well. Short story, a lot of that stuff obviously very popular in Jund. It's what Jund likes to do. Jund likes to look at your hand, turn 1, get rid of something. Ideally, turn 2, put down some sort of threat or recurring card advantage, which would normally be Dark Confidant, or Tarmogoyf is your threat. And then turn 3, get into a Liliana. The difference with this deck is we're getting rid of the green for basically value plays in Jace and or Snapcaster, although Snapcaster is really going to be cast on turn 2. In that case, you're casting Abbott. And so again, the Jace and Snapcaster are just for recurring value. Jace and Snapcaster with Kolaghan's Command just creates some pretty bananas plays. So anyway, that's the basics of it. We're also running Serum Visions for some filtering, Thought Scour to help fill up the graveyard. A lot of the filling up the graveyard is for Tasigur, but it's also there to help make sure you can flip Jace on turn 3 as much as possible. And excuse me, Abbot of Carol Keep is our 2/1 2-drop with prowess. When it enters the battlefield, exile the top card of your library until end of turn. So you don't necessarily have to cast this right away on turn 2. In fact, if you cast it on turn 2, you're never going to get to play the card that comes off the top. And at 2/1, it's a pretty terrible blocker, especially because most of this deck is not at instant speed. A lot of this is sorcery speed. But what it does is it attacks the decks that you might have trouble with, primarily combo, by giving you an early beater. So if you play this turn 2 and then turn 3 you run an Inquisition and a Lightning Bolt or a Liliana, you're pumping him to get more damage in. And if you do, Lightning Bolt plus Inquisition, and then attack with Abbott, you are hitting, for 4 if you play 2 spells, taking a card out of their hand and doing another 3 damage and direct damage with Lightning Bolt. So it's good in the matchups that you're weak. And it isn't a great blocker, but in the matchups where it isn't a great blocker, it buys you time to get to the point of the game where you can take over. So that's what that's there for. Snapcaster to do what Snapcaster does. Again, Jace just offers so much recurring value over the course of a game. Kolaghan's Command, this is just a great card. I mean, there's so many things that you do with it over the course of a game. Destroying artifacts, making your opponent discard a card, doing 2 damage to creatures or players, getting a Jace back from your graveyard or an Abbot of Carol Keep back from your graveyard, things like that. Rise Fall. The fall, primarily what you're playing this for is the fall half. The fall half is target player reveals 2 cards at random from his or her hand, then discards each non-land card revealed this way. It's basically like Hymn to Turok. It's a weaker Hymn to Turok, less consistent. You can't hit lands, which makes it weaker, but it can still be very good. The big benefit of this card, which cannot be fused, unfortunately, is that the Rise half has relevancy later in the game, where you can return target creature card from a graveyard and a target creature card on the battlefield to their owner's hand. So, return an Abbot of Carol Keep to your hand while bouncing your opponent's creature. Unfortunately, it's sorcery speed, but it'd probably be too good if it was instant speed. And then Tasigur as your beater, your big body beater. And Liliana, obviously doing what Liliana does. Running 8 fetches, a couple creeping tar pits as alternate win cons. Blackleaf Cliffs. One thing you'll notice is the deck is a lot more black, black-red than blue. Blue is a light color in this. It's the tertiary color, if you will. So that is the main deck. So far from my testing, I'm about 20 matches in, the decks that it has the most trouble with, and keep in mind that I break decks down into about 8 archetypes, is straight aggro, which is just a high velocity of bodies with, not to say no synergy, but it's more focused on just getting a bunch of bodies down to attack as soon as possible. And so these are more like the lots of one-drop decks like Suicide Zoo, or Burn's a little bit tough because of life loss as well, but Bogles, which isn't a lot of creatures, but it gets a creature, and we don't have a lot of excuse me, we don't have a lot of removal that can handle that. But those sort of decks, Naya decks. So anyway, the decks that just throw a lot of creatures down, maybe like White Goyfs, if you ever have heard of White Goyfs, which is, what's the Step Links, and then, I can't remember the name of the creature. They don't see a whole lot of play, but it's basically the Champion of the Parish, I think, where it gets a counter every time a human enters the battlefield. So it's a bunch of cheap creatures, but they get big fairly fast. We do have removal, but when they throw so many threats down, most of our removal is 1-for-1. And so if they just keep throwing them down, they keep attacking us. Our creatures are not the greatest blockers early, and our removal can only handle so much if they have a really heavy mass of creatures. If they don't have a heavy mass of creatures, the matchups are more fair. Now, the synergistic aggro decks, more like combo aggro decks like Affinity or Elves, things like that, are not as bad. But straight, just throw as many creatures on the battlefield as possible and kill you with repeated damage. That sort of deck is a deck this deck's not as great against. The other ones are just straight combo decks, which typically are going to go off with some sort of spell that has to be countered or be kept out of their hand. Well, sometimes what happens is the decks, like Ad Nauseam would be a good example. Tron could be a good example. Maybe Living End. But anyway, so short story long is combo decks, basically, that all of a sudden just kind of go off. So we're not running any counter magic. Despite being blue, we're not running any counter magic in the main deck. So what we do post-board is run a couple counter magic spells and counter squall. One of the other things we're trying to do post-board is kill them as fast as possible. We're trying to take cards out of their hand, kill them as fast as possible. So I'm running counter squall to also do 2 damage while we counter, ideally, a key combo card for them. Swan Song also counter target enchantment, instant or sorcery spell. Its controller puts a 2/2 bluebird creature token with flying onto the battlefield. Catches everything where Dispel only catches an instant, but again, we're playing this more for the decks that we're not worried about them having a 2/2 creature on the board. Void Snare can just be brought in against a ton of stuff. This deck operates really well at sorcery speed. Can bounce creatures with tokens on it, or counters on it, so like a Scavenging Ooze, or say your opponent has Arcbound Ravager that they sacrificed for a bunch of counters onto a creature. You can use Void Snare to bounce that back. They lose all the counters. The other reason I'm running this is some of those decks we have trouble against, like Ad Nauseam, Bogles, that bring in 4 Leyline of Sanctity. This deck has a lot of trouble when Leyline of Sanctity comes down because we're running so many spells that target. Lightning bolts can't hit your opponent all of a sudden. They're not playing creatures, or their creatures are hexproof. You can't target them to use Inquisition of Kozilek or Thoughtseize. You can't... While you can activate Lily's +1, you can't activate either of the other two abilities. Kolaghan's Command, a whole lot of stuff becomes a problem. You can't put 2 damage to them or target them to discard a card. Rise and Fall, the fall half becomes irrelevant. So Void Snare is to help hit those right away so that we can try and get back into the game. But Void Snare can hit anything, so it's also good against one of this deck's weaknesses, which is enchantments. Decks that are running enchantments are problematic, and Void Snare helps with that. And again, because of Jace and Snapcaster, repeatable. The other thing, we have Vampiric Link for life gain. This primarily for burn. Put it on Eidolon, but you could also put it on like a fatty your opponent has to offset the damage they're trying to do. Spellskite, for what Spellskite does, it's just can be done in so many. It can be good in so many matchups. Engineered Explosive, partially because we're having trouble with those 1-drop, get as many creatures on the board as fast as possible things, but also it can help in the decks that play like a lot of enchantments. Or artifacts. You can drop one of these. It's a way to get rid of some of those things. Vapor Snag is another thing just to slow down the creature decks that are throwing a lot of creatures on the board. Grim Lavamancer, repeatable removal for same sort of concept, small aggro creature decks. Also in the decks where you just need to get more damage in faster, you bring it in because you can get a little more damage in faster, more creatures early. And then Molten Rain to help against greedy mana decks and combo mana decks like Tron, things like that. So this is the deck tech for Blue Jund, and it's very much a deck in progress. It's fairly new. Obviously, a big part of what's driven the deck is Jace, which just came out in Magic Origins. So we're going to get some more matches in and hopefully you enjoy.